Hey everyone. So the United States, along with the Gulf states, proposed a resolution to the UN Security Council, the United Nations Security Council today, calling on Iran to cease its attacks on shipping in the Straits of Hormuz and condemning it. And that causes one to obviously wonder, why on earth even bother with the United Nations? Everyone knows the United Nations is an impotent, incompetent organization that's not really going to do anything productive. And that's the question I want to answer in this video. Why is the United States even bothering with a UN Security Council resolution at this time? And I think that it's actually a very important move, and I'm going to make that case in this video. First, we're going to talk about the resolution itself, and then we're going to pull back the camera and talk about the overall approach of the Trump administration to the United Nations. That's the real story here. So let's get started with Secretary of State Rubio talking about this move.
What is the purpose of the UN? The UN was supposed to be a place where you could peacefully resolve global conflict. Right now, you have a country who is unlawfully, criminally, and illegally taking possession of an international waterway and blowing up commercial vessels and putting mines in the water. I don't know if people appreciate how outrageous this is, how unacceptable it is that any country would fire and try to sink commercial vessels or put mines in the water. Both of these things are illegal. And so we're going to take it to the UN, and we're going to give it another chance to be a forum in which we're not even asking people like commit troops to the region and help blow up the Iranian boat. All we're asking them to do is to condemn it, to call on Iran to stop blowing ships, to remove these mines, and to allow humanitarian relief to come through because there's humanitarian aid that's trapped. That's it. This is a very modest request. And if you're telling me that the international community and hundreds of countries cannot rally behind that, then I don't know what the utility of the UN system is if it can't even solve something as straightforward as that.
So that's Secretary of State Rubio. And here is United States Ambassador to the United Nations, Mike Waltz, at the press conference alongside the Gulf state ambassadors. I'm not going to play you his full remarks, just the last 2 minutes of what he had to say.
So, look, this should be a simple demand. The removal of mines from an international waterway, that you cannot exact illegal tolls. We have to address these violations here in the council. And we have to ask ourselves, if a country chooses to oppose such a simple proposition, do they really want peace? As energy and food costs rise for the world's peoples, and if aid fails to reach the very people that the countries in the council claim to care about, what does that really say for the UN? What does that say for these countries abiding by international law? And also, what does it say and the choices they're making? Now's the time for choosing. And are the countries of the council choosing to stand with a regime that slaughters its own people, that brutalizes its neighbors, that strangles the world's economy? Or are they standing with the shining cities of Manama, Kuwait City, Dubai, Riyadh, Doha, with the people that seek a better future for not only their people, but for the region and for the world? I don't know. I know what decision the United States is making. And we're choosing to stand with the freedom of navigation. We're choosing to stand with international law. We're choosing to stand with our partners as we move forward. So we're giving the UN and the Security Council another chance, get back to basics, to uphold these basic principles, to build on Resolution 2817, passed without opposition in this council with 136 co-sponsors. And we'll see what the council decides to do in the days to come. Thank you. And
Okay, so you see both from his statement there and from Secretary of State Rubio's statement that the real focus, what they're really saying is that this is a test. Kind of reminds me of the whole NATO situation. I've made a few videos about it. If you watch the channel, you've seen them. If not, you should make sure to watch them. I've made a number of videos about this whole approach to the NATO countries who refused to help during the Iran war, where President Trump has been saying, look, we didn't really need your help, but we were just checking to see if you're willing to do it. And I pointed out that in the National Security Strategy document published back in the fall, the Trump administration said outright that they would be doing tests like this to see who's actually willing to step up, and so it's similar. It's not the exact same thing, but it's similar to what's happening here with the United Nations, where you hear it in what Waltz is saying, you heard it in what Rubio said. They're basically saying, listen, this is an opportunity for the UN to show what it's actually made of. So it seems to me that there's something bigger going on in terms of testing the UN. Look, one thing we have to be clear about: the goal of this resolution is not to actually solve the problem that it states that it will solve. UN resolutions never solve anything. And the Trump administration has no illusions about this. They don't actually think that by passing a resolution in the UN Security Council, that's going to get Iran to stop what they're doing, and it's going to open up the Straits of Hormuz. So we'll get more into this in a bit. Let's first finish with the resolution itself, and then we'll pull back the camera and talk about the bigger picture. So on the resolution itself, the chances of it passing are actually quite slim. As you see this story here, this is from the Jerusalem Post, but it's really a Reuters story. U.S. proposed Iran resolution at UN faces likely vetoes from China and Russia. And it says here that the U.S. and Russia, that the Chinese and the Russians are likely to veto it. A Chinese veto would be awkward ahead of U.S. President Trump's trip to China next week, where the Iran war is likely to be high on the agenda. A previous resolution backed by the United States that appeared to open a path to legitimizing U.S. military action against Iran failed last month after Russia and China exercised their vetoes in the 15-member UN Security Council. Standing alongside envoys of Gulf countries that support the draft, Mike Waltz said that any country that disagrees with this resolution is setting a dangerous precedent. And then he quotes more from what I showed you. The text was drafted by the U.S. and Bahrain. It had the support of the Saudis, Emiratis, Kuwait, and Qatar. Diplomats said the resolution ran into strong Chinese and Russian objections when the Security Council discussed it in closed session this week and would likely prompt them to veto it. Bahrain's UN envoy Jamal Faris Al-Rawai said that Bahrain looked forward, quote, to working constructively with all council members in the days ahead to finalize the text. Waltz's comments came as sources and officials said the United States and Iran were edging toward a temporary agreement to halt the war. Okay. Now look at this. While Russia and China have not officially commented, one diplomat said that Russia called for the draft to be withdrawn or completely rewritten. The diplomat said China contended that the text was biased and criticized its invocation of Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which allows the Security Council to impose measures ranging from sanctions to military action. So this resolution is written to have some teeth. It's not just a kind of messaging resolution. And that's what China was opposed to. The draft condemns Iran's alleged violations of the current ceasefire and, quote, and its actions, quote, actions, threats aimed at closing, obstructing, and tolling freedom of navigation through the strait. It cannot be stressed enough, like Marco Rubio said, and Mike Waltz said, it is completely illegal what they're doing there. You can't charge a toll to go through an international waterway. It would be like Morocco and Gibraltar or Portugal or Spain, just like closing the opening to the Mediterranean and just charging everyone a toll to go through there. You can't do that. So the resolution demands that Iran immediately cease attacks and to disclose the locations of their mines and not impede clearance operations. And then it quotes Marco Rubio. So that's the chances of it passing. Now, what is this really all about? So I want to take you back to a speech that President Trump gave at the United Nations this past September. Okay? And I'm going to play you two short excerpts from the speech. Two excerpts from the speech. Well, one of them is not so short. One of them is about 5 minutes long. 5-6 minutes, and then we're going to play a very short excerpt. Two pieces of the speech.
That being the case, what is the purpose of the United Nations? The UN has such tremendous potential. I've always said it. It has such tremendous, tremendous potential, but it's not even coming close to living up to that potential. For the most part, at least for now, all they seem to do is write a really strongly worded letter and then never follow that letter up. It's empty words, and empty words don't solve war. The only thing that solves war and wars is action. Now, after ending all of these wars and also earlier negotiating the Abraham Accords, which is a very big thing for which our country received no credit, never receives credit. Everyone says that I should get the Nobel Peace Prize for each one of these achievements. But for me, the real prize will be the sons and daughters who live to grow up with their mothers and fathers, because millions of people are no longer being killed in endless and unglorious wars. What I care about is not winning prizes, it's saving lives. We saved millions and millions of lives with the 7 wars. And we have others that we're working on, and you know that. Many years ago, a very successful real estate developer in New York, known as Donald J. Trump, I bid on the renovation and rebuilding of this very United Nations complex. I remember it so well. I said at the time that I would do it for $500 million, rebuilding everything. It would be beautiful. I used to talk about, I'm going to give you marble floors. They're going to give you terrazzo. I'm going to give you the best of everything. You're going to have mahogany walls. They're going to give you plastic. But they decided to go in another direction, which was much more expensive at the time, and which actually produced a far inferior product. And I realized that they did not know what they were doing when it came to construction, and that their building concepts were so wrong, and the product that they were proposing to build was so bad and so costly. It was going to cost them a fortune. And I said, and wait till you see the overruns. Well, I turned out to be right. They had massive cost overruns and spent between $2 and $4 billion on the building, and did not even get the marble floors that I promised them. You walk on terrazzo. Do you notice that? As far as I'm concerned, frankly, looking at the building and getting stuck on the escalator, they still haven't finished the job. They still haven't finished. That was years ago. The project was so corrupt that Congress actually asked me to testify before them on the tremendous waste of money, because it turned out that they had no idea what it was, but they knew it was anywhere between $2 and $4 billion as opposed to $500 million with a guarantee. But they had no idea, and I said it cost much more than $5 billion. Unfortunately, many things in the United Nations are happening just like that, but on an even much bigger scale, much, much bigger. Very sad to see. Whether the UN can manage to play a productive role, I've come here today to offer the hand of American leadership and friendship to any nation in this assembly that is willing to join us in forging a safer, more prosperous world. And it's a world that we'll be much happier with. A dramatically better future is within our reach. But to get there, we must reject the failed approaches of the past and work together to confront some of the greatest threats in history. There is no more serious danger to our planet today than the most powerful and destructive weapons ever devised by man, of which the United States, as you know, has many. Just as I did in my first term, I've made containing these threats a top priority, starting with the nation of Iran. My position is very simple. The world's #1 sponsor of terror can never be allowed to possess the most dangerous weapon. That's why shortly after taking office, I sent the so-called Supreme Leader a letter making a generous offer. I extended a pledge of full cooperation in exchange for a suspension of Iran's nuclear program. The regime's answer was to continue their constant threats to their neighbors and U.S. interests throughout the region, and some great countries that are right nearby. Today, many of Iran's former military commanders, in fact, I can say almost all of them, are no longer with us. They're dead. And 3 months ago, in Operation Midnight Hammer, 7 American B-2 bombers dropped the 14 30,000-pound each bombs on Iran's key nuclear facilities, totally obliterating everything. No other country on earth could have done what we did. No other country has the equipment to do what we did. We have the greatest weapons on earth. We hate to use them. But we did something that for 22 years people wanted to do. With Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity demolished, I immediately brokered an end to the 12-day war, as it's called, between Israel and Iran, with both sides agreeing to fight no longer.
Okay. Now, that tangent about the building costs of the UN was not a tangent. That was Trump speak for using this as an example of the incompetence, of the waste, of maybe the fraud that goes on there. And then later on in the speech, he said this.
Not only is the UN not solving the problems it should, too often, it's actually creating new problems for us to solve. The best example is the number one political issue of our time, the crisis of uncontrolled migration. It's uncontrolled. Your countries are being ruined. The United Nations is funding an assault on Western countries and their borders. In 2024, the UN budgeted $372 million in cash assistance to support an estimated 624,000 migrants journeying into the United States. Think of that. The UN is supporting people that are illegally coming into the United States, and then we have to get them out. The UN also provided food, shelter, transportation, and debit cards to illegal aliens. Can you believe that? On the way to infiltrate our southern border. Millions of people came through that southern border. Just a year ago, millions and millions of people were pouring in, 25 million altogether over the 4 years of the incompetent Biden administration. And now we have it stopped, totally stopped. In fact, they're not even coming anymore because they know they can't get through. But what took place is totally unacceptable. The UN is supposed to stop invasions, not create them and not finance them.
So, yeah, that's President Trump, really calling out the UN, being very blunt about it and saying that the UN causes more problems than it solves and that it's not living up to expectations. You put that and now put what Rubio and Waltz said about this resolution in context, that we're giving the UN a chance to prove itself, that, the United States has decided what it's going to do. Let's see what the UN decides it's going to do. And you also have to take into account the following. This is a story from this week, from 4 days ago, went under the radar because everyone's focused on other things. Trump officials threaten UN budget cuts as U.S. pushes trade over aid agenda. The Trump administration is continuing to pressure the United Nations and the international aid sector more broadly to adopt trade-focused policies to benefit U.S. firms or face the threat of further budget cuts. I'm going to jump down a little bit. The Trump administration also largely suspended support for agencies, including the World Health Organization, the UN Human Rights Council, and the UN's cultural body, UNESCO. And I'm going to jump down. There's a passage here I want to read to you. The U.S. and the UN have been at odds publicly, but never to such an extent. In February, at a UN security conference in Munich, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio criticized the UN for having, quote, virtually no role in resolving conflicts and called for significant reforms. Look at that. And we saw, and this story from February as well, from February 11th, a few months ago, U.S. to keep pressure on UN for reforms while paying its dues, says U.S. Ambassador. Let's read this piece. The U.S. will keep pressuring the United Nations to reform after withdrawing from dozens of UN agencies and cutting millions of dollars in funding last year, the U.S. ambassador to the UN said on Wednesday. Ambassador Mike Waltz also reiterated that a down payment from Washington to the global organization would come within weeks because the U.S. has dues that they owe. The U.S. is the biggest contributor to the UN budget, but under the administration of President Trump, it has refused to make mandatory payments to the UN's regular and peacekeeping budgets and slashed voluntary funding to UN agencies with their own budgets. UN officials say the U.S. owed $2.19 billion to the regular UN budget as of the start of February, more than 95% of the total owed by countries globally. Because countries have to pay UN dues. They don't all pay the same amount. They pay it's It's an amount based on what your GDP is and some other factors. And because the US has the biggest economy in the world by far, they end up having to pay the most. The US also owes another $2.4 billion for current and past peacekeeping missions and $43.6 million for UN tribunals. Waltz, speaking in Geneva, did not detail how much the UN would receive, but said the US will pay its dues while pressing the organization for reforms. Quote, "We're going to continue sustained pressure on demanding efficiency." Think back to that story that Trump told. Again, it wasn't just a funny story. He was trying to point to the incompetence and the inefficiency. "We're going to continue to ask these agencies to do at least the same amount, if not more, with less. We're going to pay those dues and we're going to continue to demand reforms. We're off to a good start," Waltz said. Right. And then in January, Trump announced the U.S. withdrawal from dozens of international organizations and UN entities, saying they operated contrary to U.S. national interests. Waltz said the UN needed to take cost-saving measures, including embracing remote work, using AI for translation, as well as relocating staff away from the UN headquarters in two of the world's most expensive cities, New York and Geneva. That's why they like being there. All these people from all these third world countries love that they could live in Geneva or New York while they're being ambassador. They don't want to move. Some UN agencies like UNICEF have announced relocations of thousands of their staff to cheaper locations. Okay. So now you get the picture of what's actually going on here. And this is what I wanted to say in this video. You see, here's what I want to say. This resolution that we saw today, if you listen to Rubio, you listen to Waltz, you think back to what they were saying about NATO over the last few weeks. Think about what Trump said to the UN in September. All the cost cutting, all the pulling out of NATO, of UN agencies. Just a few days ago, the Trump administration saying that they want to stop just the handouts and start building around investment. It's much more efficient. It's much more effective. You put the whole picture together, and what Trump is doing is this is all the king has no clothes campaign. Like all of this incompetence and inefficiency and countries not living up to their commitments. The UN is supposed to solve problems. It doesn't solve any problems. It's supposed to stop wars. It doesn't stop wars. So Trump's calling it all out. NATO members are not supposed to be protectorates of the United States. They're supposed to be members in an organization where they pay their share. They don't. Trump's calling it all out. He's calling it all out, and he's laying down the law, and he's saying, listen, the United States is not going to be taken for a ride anymore. So a UN Security Council resolution, which usually we just kind of roll our eyes like, who cares what the UN Security Council has to say? It doesn't really mean anything. Sometimes it's binding, and that could be a problem for Israel because they're always condemning Israel, and the United States vetoes those. What they're doing is they're testing. And the test makes everything public. As Waltz and Rubio both said, what country can get up and say, we're not going to condemn, we're not going to call on Iran to stop charging illegal tolls and laying mines in an international waterway that is not theirs to begin with? It's literally like if me and a couple friends took guns and went out into the highway, set up a toll booth, and just threatened everyone who came by that if they didn't pay up, we'd shoot them. You cannot do, that's what Iran is doing, as Rubio pointed out in that first clip. But look at the big picture of what the Trump administration is doing. It's been high time. Look, the UN has been a corrupt, incompetent, useless, or worse organization for many, many years, for decades. The whole construct is flawed. It makes no sense. Why should all these little countries each have a share, each have a vote? Why should any country that's not a democracy have a vote? Think about it. I mean, do you believe that any form of government is legitimate when someone just seizes power as a dictator? Why should those countries have equal votes with democracies? Why should we honor that? Why should we care what they have to say? The whole thing is absurd. And I actually believe that the UN is the cause of, or it's a contributing factor, I should say. It's a contributing factor to a lot of bad actors remaining in power as long as they do, because everyone's granted legitimacy by this international law and these international bodies. But I love what the Trump administration is doing, because the UN, it's been high time that someone actually spoke the truth about the UN. And that's really what I think this is all about. It's putting it out there so that it's very clear, because when the dust settles in this whole Iran war, just like with the NATO countries and Trump pulling troops out of Germany and saying that they're gonna support countries that actually step up to the plate, and now with the whole Strait of Hormuz thing, which countries are with us, who's against us? Go ahead, UN Security Council, say it on the open stage, say it out there. Are you for or against the Iranian regime conducting illegal piracy on the high seas? Anyway, that's what I think this is all about. Please make sure that you're subscribed to this channel and to Israel 365 News, and that you are subscribed to our newsletters. You'll find that in the link and description in the link in the description of this video. Thank you so much for helping grow the channel, for watching, and for sharing these videos. And I really appreciate it. God bless.